Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to BDB Pitmans' latest employment webinar, where we'll be looking at the key points of the recently announced job support scheme. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nick Clarice. I'm one of the partners in the employment team here at BDB Pitmans, and I'm joined today by Tim Hayes, who's one of the legal directors in our team. And together we'll take you through the important sections of the scheme. We'll also touch briefly on the job retention bonus as well, as I know that that will be an important aspect that you'll also be thinking about at this time. Now, we're still waiting for the government's guidance on the scheme, and so there remain a number of unanswered questions, but at least we've been given a bit more time than we were for the furlough scheme to kind of grasp with these issues before the scheme kicks off. Now, I think ever since it became clear that the furlough scheme would definitely be ending at the end of this month, and with the economy still very much affected by the impact of COVID-19, there have been increasingly loud calls for the government to continue to provide some form of support to organisations in order for them to be able to retain their staff. The job support scheme is a result and is a similar scheme to those which are already up and running in France and Germany. Before I hand over to Tim, who will give you an introduction to the scheme, I'd just like to cover a couple of housekeeping points. At the bottom of your screens, you'll see the normal Zoom functions. And if I could point you in particular to the Q&A button, this is where you can ask questions about what we're talking about today. And we'll answer these at the end of our session. We'd like the session to be as interactive as possible, and we'd really like to hear your views and thoughts on the job support scheme. So please do feel free to ask questions. We'd love to hear from them. Just make sure that you do press the Q&A button, not the chat function. It's the Q&A button that we'll be looking at. Well, look, I think that's all from me as a bit of an introduction. Thank you very much again for joining us. And now I hand you over to Tim to kick things off. Over to you, Tim.
Thank you, Nick. Well, there he is, the man of the hour, Dishy Rishi, as he's sometimes referred to. And maybe he's being called or referred to as Dishy Rishi because as Chancellor, he seems to have been dishing out quite a lot of cash, unfortunately, given the way that the year has gone so far. It's also a sign of the times that he's flanked in that picture as he announced the new job support scheme by the leaders of the TUC and the CBI. Suggests a broad consensus that the government needs to take action to support the economy, particularly as the coronavirus job retention scheme ends. So all we have at the moment, as Nick said, is sort of current guidance that's apparently, according to the government, going to be supplemented. The government have a habit of releasing the finer detail of schemes sort of on a Friday afternoon. So maybe this webinar will be good for about 48 hours before we need to update you all. But we should be able to give you a good idea of how the scheme works and how to make a claim. So if we just go on to the next slide. So we're going to start off with what is the job support scheme and how does it work? Well, it's intended to support viable businesses to retain employees in work and provide employers the option to reduce the number of hours that employees work rather than implementing redundancies. And as the slide says, it's going to run for a period of 6 months and it's going to start from the 1st of November, as I said, taking over from the coronavirus job retention scheme as it ends. So employees have got to work a minimum of a third of their contracted hours. That's going to be paid for by the employer. And then for the remaining 2/3 of their hours, a third of that 2/3 is going to be paid by the employer. And a third of the 2/3 is going to be paid for by the government. And this is where my C grade at GCSE maths fails me and I have to get the calculator out or read the guidance. It basically means that 55% of an employee's salary ends up being paid by the employer and 22% is paid by the government. and therefore the employee ends up receiving at least 77% of their salary. That government contribution is going to be capped at £697.92 a month, and the grant is paid in arrears. The government contribution is paid in arrears. It is expected, because that's what the guidance seems to suggest, that employers are not going to be able to top up employees' wages above that 2/3 contribution to the hours that they don't work, and that's a difference from the coronavirus job retention scheme. But we'll wait for the guidance to see how that's going to work, and whether that's going to be definitively the case. So if you move on to the next slide, I'm just going to talk briefly about who the job support scheme applies to. And if we take employers first, so it basically is available to all UK employers who are facing lower demand because of COVID-19. That's employers with a UK bank account, the UK PAYE scheme. It's available without further inquiry by HMRC to all small and medium-sized enterprises, so that they'll all be eligible without a financial assessment test. The government hasn't at the moment provided a definition of what a small and medium-sized enterprise is in this context, but the usual definition will probably apply, which is at least one of turnover of less than 25 million, under 250 employees, or gross assets of less than 12.5 million. Large businesses, they will be eligible to participate in the scheme, but they're going to be required to demonstrate that their business has been adversely affected by COVID-19. So basically what we're talking about there is turnover. Turnover has been adversely affected. And the government expects that large employers, if they access the scheme, are not going to be making capital distributions, such as in the form of dividends. So that's employers. If we move on to the next slide, we can see who what employees the job support scheme applies to. So it's open, in a nutshell, to all employees, even if they haven't been previously furloughed, provided that they can work at least a third of their usual hours. You can't re-engage an employee that was made redundant because of COVID-19 and place them on the job support scheme. And that's a contrast to the coronavirus job retention scheme as well. Nor can an employee be on redundancy notice. And that's also a big contrast to the CJRS, where the scheme did pay out for employees working their redundancy notice. We don't currently know whether you can do a redundancy consultation and still access the scheme. So that's a big question mark, which a lot of practitioners and commentators are asking at the moment, and that's probably one of the first issues to be covered off in the more in-depth government guidance. Employees who are it's intended should be covered by the scheme must have been on your PAYE payroll on or before the 23rd of September of this year. So that basically means that real-time information and RTI submission notifying payment to that employee to HMRC must have been made on or before the 23rd of September, and that includes employees on 0 hours contracts and irregular hours. So let's move on to the next slide. What does reduced hours mean? Well, an employee's got to be working 33% of their usual hours, and that's likely to be calculated in a similar way to the flexible furlough calculations in the coronavirus job retention scheme, whereby usual hours, if you're looking at fixed hours, you would start with the hours that your employee was contracted for at the end of the last pay period, ending on or before the 19th of March. So, for example, 35 hours for an employee working Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 with a 1 hour lunch break. And then you divide by the number of calendar days in that repeating work pattern. including your non-working days. So for the 35-hour example, you would divide that by 7 days, and that produces 5. And then you multiply that by the number of calendar days in the pay period and round it up to the next whole number. So that's for fixed hours. For variable hours, you would be looking at the average number of hours worked in the tax year 2019 to 2020, or the corresponding calendar period in that 2019 to 2020 tax year. So as I've said, you can't make someone redundant or put someone on notice of redundancy during the period to be covered by the job support scheme. The government's also to confirm how the scheme is going to impact on annual leave. So we await further guidance to assess whether holiday periods can be included, or how those are to be factored into the calculation. The government has also said that there will be calculations for those with variable working patterns, including 0 hours contracts, but it's yet to provide details. Likely to be similar, a form of calculation, as I said, to the coronavirus job retention scheme. Staff can move on and off the scheme. They don't have to be working the same pattern each month, but each short-time working arrangement that they are on has got to cover a minimum period of 7 days. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So we've looked at what hours, what are the usual hours, what are the, how do you calculate what you can claim back? Well, it's based on usual wages, and it's likely that calculations of usual wages are going to follow a similar methodology as for the CJRS. Again, full details have been promised by the government to follow shortly. So for staff who've previously been furloughed, their usual wage is going to be based on their underlying usual pay and or hours, and not the amount that they were paid during furlough. And again, we're waiting for further guidance in terms of employees with a variable working pattern. The grant is not going to cover Class 1 employer national insurance contributions or employer pension contributions, which are going to remain payable by the employer but won't be factored into the job support grant. So how do you make a claim? The next slide, if we can move on to it, you can make a claim online through gov.uk, as most things are done nowadays, which involve interaction with the government. So you can launch those online claims from December of this year. They're going to be, the grants under the scheme are going to be paid on a monthly basis in arrears. And what that means in practice is, as is set out on the slide there, a claim, you can only submit a claim in respect of a given pay period after payment has been made and after the payment's been reported to HMRC via the RTI return. The government has also said that the employer must agree, similar to the coronavirus job retention scheme, the new short-time working arrangements with employees. So you're going to be making changes to employee contracts by agreement, and you've got to notify the employee in writing and document those changes. So you've got to have evidence that that's been agreed by the employee. So this is probably a good juncture at which Nick should take over and take you through some worked examples. These are not real people, they're fictional characters, and then any resemblance to of their names to real life characters is entirely coincidental. Nick, is that the case?
Yeah, absolutely, as we'll see. If we can just have a look at the next slide, and we'll try to put into effect the points that Tim's just been talking about. Sorry, it's going to seem like a bit like a year 5 or 6 maths lesson for the next few minutes, but hopefully it will help to just kind of put what Tim's been talking about into a bit more clarity. So, as Tim says, the names that we've used here are purely coincidental. So let's kick off by looking at our first example. So Boris normally works 5 days a week and earns £350 a week. his company, and I'll let you think up a name for his company. His company is suffering reduced sales due to coronavirus. And rather than making Boris redundant, his company wants to put him on the job support scheme, working 2 days a week, which is 40% of his usual hours. So his employer will pay Boris £140 for the days that he works. And for the time that he is not working, 3 days or 60% of his usual hours, and that's worth £210, he will earn 2/3 or £140, bringing his total earnings to £280 or 80% of his normal wage. The government will give a grant worth £70, again, 1/3 of the hours not worked, equivalent to 20% of his normal wages. And they will pay that to Boris's employer to support them in keeping his job. And then you can see in the table there on the slide kind of the different breakdowns and different percentages depending on the hours that an employee kind of normally works in a week under the job support scheme. So rising from 1/3, 40%, 50%, etc. And then the equivalent grants that the government would pay towards their normal wages. Great. If we could now have a look at the next slide. And this is, we're now looking at an hours per week example rather than just a kind of pure number of days. So Boris's next door neighbor Rishi is contracted for 40 hours per week and is paid in the region of £577 per week, which is £14.43 per hour or around £30,000 a year. He'll now work 13 hours per week, and this leaves 27 hours which he won't work. For the 13 hours that he works, his company will pay Rishi £188, which is 13 times £14.43, his normal hourly rate. So of the 27 hours not worked, his company must pay for 33% of those, so 9 hours, and the government will pay 33% as well. The unworked hours cost the company £130, 9 times £14.43, and the government contributes the same amount. Rishi therefore receives pay for 31 hours, which is £448 or 80% of his normal weekly pay. So the company is paying Rishi for 9 hours per week that he is not working. Again, this is something that needs to be taken into account, and if we look at the next slide, we may think about points that you want to consider about if you do want to use a job support scheme, and what, after all, are the benefits to organisations of using the scheme and incurring the costs when employees are not working. Well, it will come down, I think, a lot of the time to the skills of the particular individual or employee, and whether you feel it's worth incurring some cost in order to ensure that you retain those skills within your business. Making employees redundant and then potentially rehiring them at a later point could be a risky strategy. They could go elsewhere and those skills may be lost for your business forever. If you found that typically it's been difficult to find a particular skill set that individuals have, then it could be worth thinking about making the investment that the business will need through the job support scheme in order to keep the employees with you and ready and willing to work when things pick up again. Now, you could, again, as an alternative, look at maybe reducing hours and not using the job support scheme. So what scope do you have in those circumstances? Well, if an employee has less than 2 years service, and providing that you don't act in a discriminatory way, then you could, again, like you may have done for the furlough scheme, propose reducing an employee's hours, or if it's not possible for them to agree to that, then you could look at terminating their employment at that stage. Now, if an employee has more than 2 years service, you might have a short time working or layoff clause in your contract. If you do, then you could look at exercising that clause. And where an employee has more than 2 years service and there's no kind of layoff clause in your contracts, then you could consult with individuals around reducing their hours. Again, similar way that you might have done already in relation to the furlough scheme. Now, employees may be reluctant to agree to a reduction, given that they would be worse off than if you had asked for support under the scheme, since they only receive payment for the hours that they actually work. But in the current circumstances, if the alternative to reduced hours is redundancy, then they may be more inclined to consent. But it will be a matter of discussing that with them. Now, if we could move to the next slide, please. Tim's mentioned already a couple of areas where we're still unsure and where further guidance is needed. Now, the first of those is in relation to 0 hours contracts. You can apply for support under the job support scheme for people on 0 hours contracts. But again, we're not 100% sure about how their usual hours will be calculated. Will that be similar to how those hours have been calculated on the furlough scheme? We'll wait and see. Tim's mentioned that the employer's contribution will be capped. Again, we'll see exactly what the parameters are around that, and hopefully more details will be given in the government's guidance and Treasury direction, which we've been told will be coming out in the next few weeks. Again, usual wages, will that be based on the furlough scheme rules, or will there be a different kind of calculation for that? That's a really important point, and one that I sincerely hope that the guidance does clarify. I see that we've had a number of questions about holiday and whether that contributes towards working hours or the unworking time. Holiday was one of the kind of trickiest points under the furlough scheme, and one that we had to wait quite a while before there was more definitive guidance. This is a point where we really do need clarity, because you can quite understandably see that questions will be raised here. In the same way, we need clarity about whether sickness absence contributes towards normal working hours or the period when employees aren't working. So again, we'd hope that guidance properly covers off that area. Tim's mentioned about whether redundancy consultation processes can be undergone whilst an employee is on the scheme. Again, not 100% sure at that stage. It seems likely that redundancy consultation could be started, but the guidance, or what we've had so far from the government, is absolutely clear that reimbursement can't be claimed if an employee is under notice of redundancy. Now, notice and redundancy have been linked here, so it remains to be seen. Again, hopefully guidance will cover this, about whether employees are under notice for some other reasons, such as resignation, for example, and whether reimbursement can be claimed in those circumstances. But that's still kind of watch this space at this stage. Another kind of question which we're hoping will be answered is whether the real-time information return has to be submitted in the 2020-2021 tax year or earlier. If it does, then this may affect employees such as directors who are paid annually. So we'd hope there'll be some clarity on that point. Tim's mentioned that at the moment, payments will be made in arrears, but we'll see whether the government will follow the furlough scheme and possibly allow claims to be made 14 days ahead of payroll dates. Again, that remains to be clarified. And we also need guidance on exactly what the rules will be around companies making dividends. At the moment, the government says that they expect that companies won't make dividends if they're seeking reimbursement under the job support scheme. Now, is that a wish, or will it actually be a legal requirement? Again, we'll wait and see on those points. Now, if we could move to the next slide and just look at other points just to be aware of. The government will review the minimum hours threshold after 3 months, and we'll see whether this needs to be increased or changed in any way. So the scheme isn't static, it will be reviewed as the process goes on. It's also worth bearing in mind that the self-employed grant, so those in relation to self-employed individuals, will also be extended for a period of 6 months from the 1st of November. And just to emphasize again, as Tim has said, employers will remain responsible for paying Class 1 employer national insurance contributions and pension contributions as well. We just move to, I think, the last slide, please. Yeah, I just also want to touch briefly on the job retention bonus, because although that's obviously slightly separate to the job support scheme, it's obviously a benefit that is there for organisations, and one that you may be seeking to access at the same time as the scheme generally. So the job retention bonus will continue to be available to employers who are making claims through the job support scheme, and the claims under the bonus scheme can be made between the 15th of February 2021 and the 31st of March. With all of these things, kind of further guidance is expected. And just to recap again, the job retention bonus is a £1,000 one-off taxable payment for employers for each eligible employee that you've furloughed and kept continuously employed until the 31st of January 2021. You'll be able to claim the bonus, as I said, between the 15th of February and the 31st of March, and you don't have to kind of pass on this money to your employees. Now, you can claim for employees provided that you have made an eligible claim for them under the furlough scheme. You must have kept them continuously employed from the end of your last furlough scheme in relation to them until the 31st of January 2021. They can't be serving a contractual or statutory notice period for you on the 31st of January. And this includes people who are serving notice of retirement, so it's not just redundancy, for example. And you must have paid enough to meet the job retention bonus minimum income threshold throughout the relevant periods, and that's, I think, £520 a month. Before you can claim the job retention bonus, you will need to have reported all payments made to employees between the 6th of November and the 5th of February to HMRC. So that information must be uploaded so that HMRC can assess your claim. You may also be able to claim the job retention bonus for employees of previous businesses which have transferred to you under TUPE. However, to be able to do so, you must have furloughed and successfully claimed for these transferred employees under the job retention scheme as their new employer. This means, therefore, that you won't be able to claim the bonus for any employees who have transferred to you after the furlough scheme closes on the 31st of October 2020. Well, I think that's all that Tim and I kind of had to talk about. Obviously, there have been, as I can see, a number of questions. So maybe Tim and I can pick those up. And if you have any other questions, please raise them now and we'll try to have a look at them. Okay, let's have a look at some of the questions that have been raised. Okay, so the first question that we can look at, again, this is a point that I think you touched upon, Tim, in relation to top-ups. And, you know, previously people may have topped up employee salary, maybe to living wage levels or kind of other amounts. I know the guidance is, well, not even guidance at the moment, but the government statements are kind of a bit unclear about this. Tim, what do you think the position may be there on topping up salary?
It does seem a bit harsh, doesn't it, to sort of bind employers into, well, prevent them from topping up. But I guess the government line is that in these circumstances with people or companies accessing the job support scheme, that really they're not in a position financially to be able to top up wages. So maybe that's the thinking. I don't know if there are going to be any exceptions, but yeah, at the moment, that is what the guidance indicates. So it's, unless there is something fairly clear in the guidance that comes out that contradicts what's currently the situation or the position, then it doesn't look as if employers are going to be able to top up.
Yeah, it seems strange, given that, you know, in a sense, there's no harm to the government, really. if employers top up. So yeah, it'd be really interesting to see actually whether there is a clarification at this point when kind of the more definitive guidance is published.
Maybe it's sort of discouraging. I mean, it's along that same line, isn't it? That the message is that this should be being accessed by companies that are, really facing, as the line is, problems due to COVID-19, and that in those circumstances shouldn't be topping up. So maybe it's a deterrent for those companies who perhaps think of accessing the scheme who haven't been too badly affected by it. I really don't know.
Yeah, I think the wording at the moment is that the government kind of expects that employers won't be able to top up if they're utilising the scheme, and I think that's exactly on the lines that you've said, Tim. It's potentially because the government feels that employers won't have the cash to be able to top up in those circumstances. But at the same time, it does feel slightly strange that employers wouldn't be able to do so if they felt able to. So hopefully that will be a point that's probably picked up on when we do receive further information.
Absence is another one there. I see someone's asked, Helen's asked about sickness absence, and that's another really good question that I guess we're not really able to clarify at the moment. It would seem perhaps unfair, and also those who simply can't work the minimum 33% of the hours. Is there a discrimination point there that actually they may be at a disadvantage because they can't access the scheme or because they receive less as a result of sickness absence? Again, I think that's one of the big things for the government to clarify.
Yeah, and I think another relevant consideration as well is what happens for employees who work at businesses who are forced to close because of local lockdowns. Again, obviously they won't be able to work in those circumstances. Does that mean that there'll be no possibility for reimbursement under the scheme in those circumstances? Again, that would seem harsh because it's no fault of the employer or the employee there that they've been unable to work. But at the moment, the wording is very clear, isn't it? They've got to work at least 33% of their normal working hours. So a complete shutdown where they're unable to work means the scheme can't be utilised. But again, that wouldn't seem to kind of reflect the reality of the current situation. Yeah,
and I guess what we can't do is give a definitive view because it's so. I mean, I guess the benefit is in hindsight that the CGRS scheme was followed pretty much on a weekly basis, wasn't it? By guidance, further guidance that the government basically had been on issues which had been brought to the government's attention by commentators and practitioners. So hopefully, I mean, these questions are well out there, aren't they, in the sort of employment sphere? And so one would hope that those are exactly the kinds of issues that will be dealt with very quickly, given that the scheme is just weeks away from kicking in, so that everyone knows where they stand before in terms of payment to those who are off on sick leave, on holiday leave. Because obviously you need to know where you stand. Obviously you need time in order to put agreements in place with staff as well. Well, as I mentioned, at least we've got a month, to iron out these points before the scheme is operating. Obviously, we didn't have that opportunity in relation to the first furlough scheme, which was kind of introduced straight away, and we were having to deal with these issues as the scheme went along. So again, I would hope by the 1st of November there would be, a bit more clarity about exactly how it would run in practice. I think we had another question about, what happens if you use the scheme in November but realise you need to make redundancies, say after that in December or onwards. Can employers remove people from the scheme in December to proceed with redundancies? And I think the answer to that is yes, you actually have to. If you do want to be making redundancies, or certainly issuing notice of redundancies, individuals will
have to be removed from the scheme, and they can't be claimed for under it. I think that's right. Is that your impression as well, Tim?
Yeah, so you can't claim for a period during which they're on notice of redundancy. So absolutely, yes, you would have to take them out, and you couldn't make any claim in respect of the period in which they are handed notice.
And I think as well, you can, again, the information that we've received so far seems to imply that you can take employees in and out of the scheme.
You can,
provided that they're the period claimed for is at least a week. So you do have a bit of flexibility there about kind of working patterns, but administratively, I can see that being an issue if you are taking people in and out all the time. But it is, potentially possible to do so. Let's have a look at some more.
Do you know when detailed guidance is expected? Marsha's asking. Wow, that's the $1 million question. I think about 5 o'clock tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely. It will almost certainly be on a Friday night. It seems to be the typical time, just as
I wonder whether they have it all prepared from a Tuesday, but they think, we'll wait a few days. No, I would hope. I mean, these are. I guess the government has had a lead in. They've had experience now with the CGRS scheme. One would hope that it's a well-trammeled path, and actually these are questions which have already got a ready-made answer to a certain extent. So it shouldn't take them too long. I suspect, I don't know what you think, Nick, but I suspect that something more will come out tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd expect that. Look, I think I don't know. I don't know whether tomorrow is optimistic. I think it will almost certainly be a Friday, but whether that's kind of this week or next week, we'll have to see. I'd certainly hope that we do get guidance as soon as possible, because as we can all see, there are so many questions which, and important questions as well, that need clarity. So yeah, I'd really hope that we do get guidance pretty soon on these points. So another question as well. Yes, just in relation to the number of working hours. It's a minimum, isn't it, of 33 hours. It's not kind of capped at 33 hours. Employees can obviously work more than those if required, but they have to work at least 33% of their normal hours.
So that's paid for by the employer, and then it's just the remainder of the unworked proportion, which then gets divvied up between employer contribution, government contribution, and unpaid.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Tash has asked a really good point about holiday being and how that will work under the scheme. Again, I think we will certainly need kind of a lot more information about that. I kind of hope that there would be scope to take a similar approach as there has been under the furlough scheme. But yeah, as we've seen, I think holiday and how that was treated has been one of the most complex issues under the furlough scheme, and I hope the government has learned from that and will specifically cover the point in the guidance that they issue. But again, we'll just have to wait and see on that point.
It's a good one from Judith there. How will we explain to people already working part-time in a 4-day week that someone else on the scheme will be paid the same doing 2 days a week? Nick.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I think that's really tricky. And I think it's been a difficult question in relation to the furlough scheme as well, because you would have had people on furlough potentially being topped up to their normal pay, whereas other employees are still actively working, working hard, potentially working kind of longer hours than normal. And I really think that is a tricky kind of employee relations point. I think you can only say again that these are pretty difficult times, and everyone has to pull together, and where you can work, you unfortunately, you do have to do so.
I
I
guess
don't think there's kind of any real answer there.
I mean, you can't be compelled as an employer to participate in the scheme as well. So if it doesn't work, as Nick says, from an employee relations perspective, then and actually, a part-time working arrangement outside of the scheme, if these guys are doing similar jobs, then there might be a way that you can implement an arrangement which doesn't necessarily involve the job support scheme, but allows the company to have people doing the work and being paid at more or less the same more or less the same number of hours part-time. So it's I guess it's not a scheme that's going to be appropriate for everyone, and I guess it is going to come down to an employee relations issue as much as it does a financial.
That's a good question here about where employers have rolled out wage reduction schemes since lockdown for those who haven't been furloughed. Again, does that count as usual wages, or do you need to kind of reinstate the 100% kind of full salary when you're looking at calculations here? I think that's a really interesting point. I can see there being a moral argument for the kind of 100% salary being used, but I think again that all come down to how the government defines kind of usual salary for these purposes.
I mean, strictly speaking, it wouldn't, would it? I mean, because it's not. Well, I mean, it would simply be a calculation on the basis of the usual wage, which would be, that reduced rate, unless the government come out and say, well, actually, or the government provides for situations in which salaries have previously been reduced as a result of COVID-19, and whether there can be an exception so that the calculation is different, so that those employees don't lose out. Again, that's a good question. Financial that is. Do employers have to complete a financial assessment to reveal that they have been impacted by the coronavirus to use the scheme? So no, as things stand, well, it's only the larger only the large employers that have to be means tested, basically, and they have to show that as a result of COVID-19. I don't think we actually have any guidance as to how that assessment is going to be carried out yet. So that's going to be quite interesting because. I guess it's not always going to be easy to be able to show that. So
I think that's right. Some areas of business may be more affected than others. So again, is it just the organisation overall, or can you show that it's only particular parts of the business that have been impacted?
But if you're a small and medium-sized enterprise, you won't be. No questions will be asked basically about your claim. As to whether you've been affected by COVID-19.
Yeah, absolutely. I saw a question on consultation, redundancy consultation. I think at the moment, our kind of understanding is that you can consult with employees who are under the job support scheme. But it's once notice of redundancy has been given that they have to be taken out. I think that's right, isn't it, Tim? But obviously that's a point that we'll hopefully kind of understand a bit better when guidance is issued.
I guess the really cautious way to proceed, if you do want to access the JSS, would be to await further guidance before before consulting. But yeah, I mean, the guidance suggests that it's only notice of redundancy, and I guess it's, even if you're consulting, it's not necessarily contradictory to the scheme, is it? Because you're still, I guess the whole purpose of consultation is to see how redundancy can be avoided. I guess it does that contradict these jobs being viable, though? The overall sort of line that this is only for viable jobs. But it's difficult. I mean, the government has not qualified that, or not clarified what it means by viable jobs any further than that. So, does redundancy consultation, contradict that? It unclear. I think the safest way to proceed is to say, well, we haven't got any guidance. If we do proceed with consultation, I guess there is a low risk that the government might come out with guidance and say, well, if you are consulting, it is also, well, it does indicate that it's not a viable job. Yeah, hopefully by the time that you reach consultation, we will have guidance that will clarify that.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's probably all we've got time for today. We will, just to say, we'll cover all of the questions that you've asked in a briefing that we'll issue to all of you after the session in the next few days. That will go out with a recording of today's session together with the slides, so you'll be able to access those and pass those on to others within your organization that couldn't make today. So we'll make sure that that is sent out to all of you, and as I said, we'll cover all the questions that we haven't had a chance to properly pick up today. But given that that's the case, thanks very much, Tim. You've been brilliant. That's a really informative and great run through of what we do know about the job support scheme today. I'd also like to say a big thank you to everyone kind of behind the scenes who have helped to make the webinar run today, particularly Melissa, who's been working really hard behind the scenes, moving the slides and making sure that everything runs properly. So thank you very, very much for that. Thank you all for joining. The questions you've asked are brilliant. We've loved to hear from them, and it really helps us to understand the thoughts that you've got on your mind about how this scheme will operate. And we really do appreciate it. In the meantime, I'd just like to say thank you very much again for joining us. Have a great day, and we look forward to you joining us again very soon. Thank you very much.
Have a great day.
Bye.